So my name is Emily Loeb, and I'm the Director of Programs and Education here at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who are new to our organization, we teach about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with the goal of building a more civil and humane society. And we run a host of programs to accomplish this. We host and organize school-based and community-facing educational programs and trainings, innovative exhibits, engaging lectures and events, and educational opportunities that cultivate a deeper understanding of the topics of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Today, you are joining us for one of our daytime virtual learning series programs, where we are able to share the work and stories of people no matter where they're located. If you're local to Pittsburgh, please note that we have a series of in-person public programs lined up during the next several months. One I'd like to highlight is in honor of the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. We hope you'll join us at 6:30 on Wednesday, June 4th at Chatham University, where we're going to screen the 20-minute film Perseverance, which is the newest edition of PA Cyber's Emmy-nominated Moments in History series that tells the story of local Holocaust survivor Melvin Goldman. The screening will be followed by a conversation with the filmmaker Scott Rutledge and Melvin's daughter Lee Keikel, who's a member of our Generation Speakers Bureau and the author of the book Perseverance: One Holocaust Survivor's Journey from Poland to America. And we'll provide a link to our events page in the chat so you can learn more about our upcoming programs. But today we're excited to host Boaz Munro. Boaz is a Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania native and a web designer now living in California with his wife and two daughters. And he's also the grandson of Holocaust survivors. In college and graduate school, Boaz studied modern Middle East history, Hebrew, and Arabic, with time abroad in Israel, Egypt, and Morocco. Boaz will be speaking today about his grandparents, Moshe and Malka Baran, both of whom survived the Holocaust in Poland. Moshe and Malka's stories embody physical and spiritual resistance, respectively. Moshe was a partisan who escaped the ghetto and rescued most of his family, while Malka, found herself orphaned by the Nazis and faced the task of finding renewed hope amid uncertainty and loss. After telling his grandparents' stories, Boaz will discuss current events, especially the recent rise in Jew hatred across the political spectrum and the lessons he's taken from both of his grandparents' stories of survival as he confronts this moment. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Boaz.
Thank you.
And I should say, if we have any questions, please put them in the chat. Sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna just start sharing my slides right away because that was such a great introduction. I want to also just thank Emily and the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh for having me. Let me set up my screen share real quick, and hopefully everyone is now seeing a slide with my picture on the left and my grandparents' picture on the right. Like Emily said, I'm Boaz Munro. I'm the son of Avi and Paul Munro, who I'm sure many of you know from Pittsburgh. And Avi is the daughter of my grandparents, Moshe and Malka Baran. Also like Emily said, I'm currently living in San Francisco, father of two girls with my wife, Emily. And I have a background in education and web design, but also in Middle East studies and Hebrew and Arabic language. And lately, have been studying the Holocaust period and many other periods of Jewish history less formally. Again, it's an honor to be here, and I'll start by covering Moshe's story. Then I'll talk about Malka's story. I'll talk about their post-war life, what brought them to Pittsburgh, some of the lessons I took from them, and how those lessons inform the work I do today outside of my day job, which I'll tell you more about a little bit later. And I'm going to leave as much time as I can for your questions. So I'm going to start by just diving into Moshe's story. My Zadie Moshe was born in a small shtetl called Horodok in Poland, in what's now Belarus, but was Poland at the time. He was born in 1920 on the fifth candle of Hanukkah, which we just learned more recently was actually December 10th, but we didn't know that until we looked it up. What you see here on the left is the market square in Horodok. Horodok was a market town farmers came from all around, non-Jewish farmers, about once a week. And the market was set up. And Moshe's house was actually right on this square where he grew up. Um, and the town was about 90% Jewish. I think there were some 300 or so Jewish families. On the right, you see a picture of Moshe with his younger brother Josh. This is the only childhood photo that we have of them, and we have it. All the pre-war photos we have, it's because they were sent to cousins in America before the war. Um, he also had twin sisters, the younger two, Minna and Musia. And you can see the only picture of them before the war here with their mother, Esther. And on the right, you can see the only picture we have of their father, Yosef, which actually appears very briefly in a film that was taken of the shtetl in the 1930s by someone who was born there, went to America, made money, and came back with a camera. So there's actually quite a lot of archival footage of Horodoc, thanks to this one person who went back with a camera. And when my mother saw this film reel when she was young, she jumped and said, "Oh my God, Dad, that's you." But it wasn't him, it was her grandfather. And this is the only picture we have of him. Um, Moshe's uncle was named Yisrael Meisel, and he was a basically the most prominent Jew in the shtetl. He was the head of the Kehillah. You can see him in the middle of this picture here of the Horodoc Free Loan Association. And the youngest of his, I think, 6 children on the right was his son Herschel Meisel, who was also one of Moshe's best friends. They grew up together. They were both popular in school. They were both good students, and they were both ardent Zionists. The Beitar movement was very strong in this area. They were learning Hebrew together. They had summer camps in the summer where they and other young Jews would go into the woods and talk about Israel and talk about moving to Israel. So Herschel was a real role model for Moshe. Um, this is a photo that we only found after he passed away last year. Somehow I overlooked it. It's the only other pre-war photo I have of Moshe. And this is when he's 17. And this is a postcard that he sent back to his family um, when he went to Lodz, which was by far the biggest trip he'd ever undertaken, for training, actually by Polish military officers, in preparation to go to Palestine and to help found the Jewish state. And he sent this postcard back to his parents. Um, in 1939, this was far enough east in Poland, for those of you who know the history. In September 1939, the Germans invaded Poland from the west, and the Soviets invaded Poland from the east, and they split it down the middle. Horodoc, in what is today Belarus, was in this eastern zone. So in the beginning of the war, Moshe and his neighbors and family were actually living under Soviet control. And that was bad enough because Jewish life in Horodoc came to an end. And it had been an observant Jewish life. Zadie went to shul, all of the families observed Shabbat. It was a very traditional Jewish existence, and that all came to an end. Many people started disappearing to Siberia. Zadie, because he worked for his uncle as a bookkeeper in his merchant business, became a bookkeeper for the Soviets. And this is a skill that would save his life many times throughout the war. Um, in the summer of 41, of course, Germany launched a surprise attack on the Soviet Union and invaded the area. Moshe actually tried to flee on foot to get out of the country and hopefully bring his family out later. He got appendicitis, had to go back and undergo surgery during the invasion. He told me only very late in his life that it was during this early period of the occupation when most of the prominent Jews were being killed that he actually saw his uncle Yisrael, Herschel's father, shot in front of either his house or Yisrael's house. Um, and at some point, I think shortly before that, Herschel actually went into hiding on a Polish farmer's property in a small hut in the field. Um, Now, Jewish life really ended here. Even though Horodoc was already a tiny shtetl, a small ghetto was formed in the southern part, and all of these 300 Jewish families had to move into just a few houses in the corner of the town and watched non-Jewish life going on as normal. Pretty soon, a bunch of young men, including Moshe and his brother, were sent away to other nearby towns for forced labor, and their parents and their twin sisters stayed in Horodoc. In July, most of the Jews of Haradak were murdered. They were put on trucks and told that they were going to be taken to do forced labor as well. But those trucks were driven to barns just outside the town. A few other of the boys escaped from those trucks and joined the partisans, but about 700 of Horodok's Jews were murdered in that massacre, including Moshe's grandmother. But none of the 6 Baran family members were killed because Moshe and his brother had already been sent away, and the remaining 4 hid on Yisrael Meisel's now abandoned property, and waited out that massacre and made their way to the town of Krasny where Moshe was working. And his brother Josh eventually got there too. So all 6 were actually reunited in a town called Krasny, not too far away. And in Krasny, Moshe was working on a railroad just outside the town under the supervision of a German officer. So he would leave the ghetto every day with a pass. He would work on the railroad all day. He would come back inside. And as this is happening, many other towns are meeting the same fate as Haradak, and the Jews are realizing that this is a complete extermination. And many of the young men, like Moshe, start making plans to run away and join some kind of partisan group. Um, luckily enough for him, he's working right near a building that houses captured Russian weapons. And he and others make a plan to ask the German supervising officer to go get scraps of food or water or whatever it might be. He's a humane guy, Captain Miller, who Moshe remembered well, and he would let them go. They would sneak the weapons parts back into the ghetto and hide them, and started making this plan to bring the weapons into the forest. The Germans weren't the only danger at the time. The partisans could also kill you if you tried to make contact with them because they would be afraid that you were a spy. So they wanted to bring weapons to show that they had something to contribute. And eventually, one night, with the help of a woman who he agreed to help escape along with her children if she would show him where Jews were hiding in the forest, he crawled under the fence and he went out into the night. And one of his most vivid memories, whenever he would recount this story, was the first morning after leaving the Krasny ghetto, um, coming to the edge of the forest and looking up in the sky, seeing birds flying in the sky, wishing that he was a bird and wishing that he was free like a bird, and also realizing that for over a year since the Germans came, he hadn't really looked up at the sky. Jews looked at the ground. They tried not to make eye contact with everyone. They were driven from place to place. And so he sort of had a taste of freedom here, even though he wasn't really free. Um, a few things happen here. One is that he makes contact with some non-Jewish partisans. These are actually Russian soldiers who were left behind enemy lines in the surprise attack and have been hiding in the thick Belarusian forests. He makes contact with them. He tells them he has weapons. He expresses interest in joining the partisans. He tells them there are more weapons inside the ghetto. And through a bunch of machinations that I never really got the full details of, they put him in touch with a Polish farmer who regularly rides in and out of the ghetto, and they're able to arrange for the farmer to take out first, I think, Minna and Josh, his brother and sister, next, the weapons, and finally, just in time, 2 days before the Krasny Ghetto is wiped out, his mother, Esther. And 2 days after she comes out, the Krasny Ghetto is liquidated. It's one of the last places with a large Jewish population in the area. Yosef, his father, and Musia, his other sister, are murdered. The pretext here is, from accounts that I've read, is that the Nazis told Jews that they were going to be inoculated against typhus, took them down to barns similar to what happened in Haradak, and shot them, burned their bodies in a huge pyre in the middle of town that people could sort of see and smell for miles. And the reason that Yosef and Musia did not escape seems to be that Musia was sick. Yosef also seems to have despaired and given up and didn't want to go chance it in the forest. So those 2 members of the Baran family were lost March 19th. When Mom and I and our brother Isaac and Zadie went to Belarus back in 2010, we actually met a non-Jewish witness to this massacre, or who saw them being taken to the massacre and saw the aftermath. Also, sometime during this period, Zadie's cousin Herschel, who had been hiding on the Polish farmer's land, was betrayed and killed by the farmer. Jewish partisans eventually found him hanging from a noose in that shed, and I learned recently tracked down the farmer and killed him. Now, so then there's a lot of stories to tell about Zaidie's time in the woods, but he was with this Soviet soldier partisan group. They were living in the forest in bunkers underground. Minna, Josh, and Esther were also living in bunkers in the forest with a group just of civilian Jews hiding. One of the great advantages of being in Belarus was the thick forests where fighters and non-fighting Jews could hide for a long time. It was hard. They lived in underground bunkers. There were brutal winters. They would beg for food or steal food from farmers nearby. But the partisans had a fair amount of freedom of movement and ability to strike the Germans on their own terms. And the German army never really was able to attack many of these groups, including Zaidis. They would do sabotage. They would blow up German rail lines. They would attack German garrisons and ambush them. But in the summer of 44, as the Soviets were pressing west, the German army started to retreat, and its retreat actually amounted to an advance on where Zaidi was. So they went on a long march, no food or water for 10 days, eventually had to turn around and face the Germans at night, which they did. They fought their way through with some losses, and the next day they were liberated. They were living under Soviet rule. Um, Hardok had been destroyed actually by partisans. So the surviving barons had to figure out what to do next. It's a long, long, complicated story, but pretty soon Zaidi was drafted into the Red Army and spent over 2 years with them marching into Germany. There's a whole story there. He was not really on the front lines, but he was, again, a bookkeeper with the sort of executive staff of the battalion. Um, and was only decommissioned from the army in 1946 or relieved of duty from the army in 1946. That's the very broad summary of Moshe. And here we are actually in Krasny in 2010 with him. This is the place where he did forced labor, where he collected the weapons parts, from where he eventually escaped. And this is where we met a man named Alexander, who, as a young boy, remembered these events and witnessing things happening around them. And we said Kaddish here for his brother and his sister. Okay, Bubby. My Bubby was Malka. Her name was Mela Klin, actually, when she was born. She was from Czestochowa, which she was actually born in Warsaw, raised in Czestochowa, which was a pretty big Polish city. And she was in a much more assimilated family than Zadie's. And grew up the oldest of her of the siblings. She also had a younger brother a few years younger named Henyek. And I'll talk a bit more about this picture in a little bit. This is a picture we only got really recently of her father, Itzik, or Isaac, who was a printer. He printed posters, flyers. He printed movie tickets for the movie theater, which meant that she got to see free movies. And her mother, Bella, and her little brother, Henyek, we have no pictures of as of now. In 1939, now this is in Western Poland, there's no Soviet interlude. The Germans invade right away, September 1939, and a ghetto is established. I think the ghetto isn't formally established right away, but they got to stay in their house because it was within the perimeter of the ghetto that was established. She remembered life changing pretty quickly, the armband, her teachers and doctors just disappearing. One day they went to the doctor, it was just boarded up, um, and life just deteriorated steadily. Not too long ago, I found this document in an archive from 1940. The title is just List of Jews Registered for Forced Labor. And this is from Czestochowa. And you can see 8 or so names down the list. Itzik Klin, Drucker means printer, and the address that Bubby always told me they lived at, 15 Stary Rynek, which is the little square. So he's here on this list. And she described to me how he and Henyek, her brother, were taken out to work frequently in the ghetto. They lived in the ghetto as a family together until September 1942. And oh, I actually did not include a picture of this, but her birthday was in January. And so her last birthday with her parents was in January 42. And they made her a heart-shaped necklace with her initials engraved in it, and it said "From your parents" on the back, and it had the date, January 30th, 1942. That was their last birthday together. They lived in the ghetto for another 9 months. September 1942 was the first mass deportation from Czestochowa. And Bubby remembers this really vividly. She has video testimony that you can watch, but she describes her parents waking them up while it was still dark, putting on many, many jackets and layers of clothes on all of them, hiding gold and money in different places. Um, Loud knock at the door, forced out onto the street. Everyone is walked in rows of five to the square, which is not far from her house. And there's a selection. And Bella, her mother, is sent to the left, and she and her brother and their father are sent to the right. Her father, Yitzhak, tries to go back to Bella and bring her back. A German soldier beats him with a rifle butt, and they're separated. And they don't see her again. Um, Later, Bubby learns that Bella was put on a train to Treblinka. And Treblinka was one of three camps that was part of Action Reinhard, which was really the German effort after the Wannsee Conference to eliminate the Jews of Poland. And it's much less famous than Auschwitz. But Reinhard actually killed one half of all the Jews in Poland in a shorter time than Auschwitz was operational, and with much less staff and much less money. 1.7 million Jews were murdered across three camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. And these were not giant camps like Auschwitz. They were tiny places in the woods um, that were really just disguised as train stations. There was a square behind the train station where Jews getting off the train were told they were going to be um, bathed and then put on another train. The men were driven down a corridor first to the gas chamber while the women's hair was cut. The women kept the children with them, and then they were gassed after the men. There were not even crematoria at these camps. The bodies were buried in huge pits, and eventually, as the war turned, they were dug up and a lot of the bodies were burned. So that is almost certainly what happened to Bella because that was the only purpose that these camps had, assuming she survived the train ride. If you've seen movies like Escape from Sobibor, you see a pretty realistic depiction of these camps. A very tiny group of Jewish workers was kept alive to manage things and organize the possessions of the Jews who were murdered, but most of them ended up being killed as well. There are a few dozen survivors from places like Treblinka and Sobibor because there were eventually revolts there. Belzec never had a revolt, only one Jewish survivor. Um, and in terms of Czestochowa, 40,000 or so of the 48,000 Jews there pre-war died at Treblinka. Treblinka alone killed 800,000 Jews. Most of the Jews of Warsaw, which this train passed through, also perished in Treblinka. Another document I just found recently is the German timetable of these six transports that went from, you can see Częstochowa, which is German for Czestochowa, to Treblinka, starting in around Rosh Hashanah, late September, and then into early October. Actually, October 7th was the last one, and the timetable of the trains coming back. I'm pretty sure that Bella was on the first train because Bubby remembered the cleansing of the ghetto and her being separated right away, but I'm not positive. So after that, Mela and Henyek and Itzik lived in the small ghetto together. Um, and eventually, her father and brother don't come back from their forced labor one day. She finds out together they were both executed. So now she's alone in the ghetto. And eventually the ghetto is cleared and the remainder is deported. She is imprisoned at a camp called Hasag. This is a arms company, and she's sorting and repairing German anti-aircraft shells. She actually remembers during the selection that led her to this camp, which is in Czestochowa. She was just walked there. There was an attack by Jewish resistance on the Germans during the selection, and people were killed all around her, but the Germans killed the Jewish resistors very quickly. She's imprisoned at Hasag. On the left, I actually found her camp registration card. So you can see that she's going to be a laborer in this camp. You can see that she's going to be in Block 60. And you can see a picture of the campgrounds here. She described life in the camp, but I blew these up too, so you can see them a bit bigger. You can see her birthday, January 30th, 1927, her maiden name. And a lot of stories from the camp. She got very sick. She nearly died of typhus. She had rashes all over her body. Luckily, like with my grandfather, the German overseer of her work floor was someone who would hand out food and sneak things to the prisoners. They were on a very, very minimal diet. Bubby also had kept one thing from her house, which was the necklace her parents gave her on her birthday. She eventually, there were Polish workers who had come into the camp. She eventually traded the chain to a Polish woman in exchange for some bread. But she kept that heart with her parents' inscription on it in the hem of her dress, and we still have it. There was also a baby that was snuck into her barrack, and he and the other women in the barrack protected him. He was eventually discovered, but this was late in the war, and the commandant of the camp spared his life, surprisingly enough, and he, I believe, is still alive, but he moved to Israel. In January 1945, the Russians came. All the guards left the work hall one day. A Jewish prisoner came in and said, "You're free, get up, let's go, the Russians are here." And Bubby remembered how none of the prisoners moved. They were too conditioned to just be passive, which is how she described a lot of her experience. And eventually he had to start pulling people up physically from their seats, and then the mass of prisoners walked out the gates of the camp and back into Czestochowa to figure out what was left. Um, there were little organizations. A few thousand Jews in Czestochowa did survive, mainly because of this camp where they needed the workforce. Um, they tried to get people back in school. Bubby went to the Polish school for one day and says that she could feel so much hatred from the Polish students around her that she never went back. So eventually, another long story, she and her friends from the camp start tagging along with the Red Army. They work as cooks and other jobs. Um, One story from here is that while she was riding along with the army, she was in the bed of a truck one night while they went to sleep in a barn. Her friend, who was sort of her protector, said, "We're absolutely not going in there with them," even though the soldiers invited them in. The Red Army deservedly had a terrible reputation when it came to women and young girls. Um, but eventually it got so cold and wet that they did go inside. They did lie down right near the entrance of the barn, and a Russian soldier put a blanket on Bubby during the night. And she said that was the beginning of the rebirth of her faith in humanity. It was a huge moment in her healing process. And this is us on an earlier trip, actually. Bubby was too sick to travel herself, but this is us standing in front of her house in Czestochowa that she and her family were removed from in 1942. So after the war, Moshe is demobilized, and Mela leaves the Red Army. They bounce around various American-run DP camps. Still, no one will take the Jews. There's about 250,000 in DP camps across Central Europe. On the left, you can see Moshe here, second from left, with his surviving sister and his brother, and their mother Esther, who was the only mother, by Moshe's account, to survive from Holocaust. And on the right is a picture of Bubby in the middle teaching children, which this became her lifelong career in the camp. This photo actually came to us from, I hope I don't get his name wrong, Harry Schneider, who lives in the building where Zadie lived until very late in his life. They met. Zadie learned that Harry was a surviving child from Europe. Harry brought him this photo and said, "This is a picture of me in my class at the DP camp." And Moshe said, "That teacher is my late wife." And Harry had had no idea. So this new precious photograph came into our possession that way. Um, some of these photos blown up slightly. You can see Bubby's face right there. And here they are. They met in the camp. They were sort of friends for a long time. It felt right away like a very special bond. But soon enough, they were separated because Esther, Moshe's mother, did not want to go to Palestine despite Moshe's ardent Zionism. She had lived through both world wars. She had lost her husband. They had these cousins in the American South in Shreveport, Louisiana, willing to sponsor them, who just by a fluke found out that they were alive. That's a whole other story. Um, and they were not married yet. Mela decided to go with others of her friends to Israel. And she arrived in 1948 during the war and was sort of adopted by families who lived there and started her teaching career in Israel. Um, but in 1952, Zadie went to Israel and married her and brought her back to now New York. They had moved up from Shreveport to New York City, which is where my mom and her sister were raised. So, okay, I already covered some of this. Um, yes. So this is what I just covered. In the mid 50s, Bella and Avi are born, and Bella, my mom's sister, makes Aliyah in the 70s and marries a Bukharan Jew. So I learned about a lot of the history of Mizrahi Jews through him. And Paul converts, marries Avi, and they have 4 children, including me. Um, One other note about Bubby is she lost all of her family members, believed that they were all murdered for many decades. But eventually, her mother's sister, Luba, who she had used to visit in Warsaw and who had actually escaped into Russia, wrote to her, and they were reunited in Israel in the 60s. So she did have one surviving aunt. Now, I was lucky enough to grow up in my very early years visiting Bubby and Zadie in New York. But when I was around 5, they moved to Pittsburgh. And so they lived in Maxon Towers. I was in Denniston and Wilkins, so just a few blocks away. They were a huge part of my upbringing. I could tell lots and lots of stories about growing up with them. Overall, I was so blessed because they were really spiritually intact. They were filled with joy. They taught us not to hate anything or anyone. And I got sort of different things from both of them. A lot of the same things, but a lot of very different things. Bubby just gave me a ton of gratitude and spiritual warmth and family energy. And Zadie gave me tons of knowledge, tons of perspective on the world. And I saw how both of them, I have a picture of Zadie doing it here, but both of them really told their story nonstop. They would talk to anyone about it. They would share not just what had happened to them, but also the lessons of that story into very old age, especially Zadie, talking everyone from elementary, middle schoolers to college students. They were really, really determined to share lessons that they learned. I'll tell one other story about Bubby, which is there was a time when we were walking home and I was hungry. I think we were only half a block from the house, and I said, I'm starving. And she stopped walking, which she didn't usually do. And she said, You're not starving. When I was in a concentration camp, I was starving. You're just hungry. And that was like a little bit of Jewish guilt. She didn't do that kind of thing very often, but it was a moment that always stuck with me. Um, but such a beautiful upbringing with both of them. They both lived into old age. Bubby died in 2007 from cancer. She was 80. And as many of you may know, Zadie only passed away last February. He was 103. And as far I believe he was well, and then Minna passed away actually earlier this year. The two of them, I think, were the last surviving Jews from Haradach anywhere. Um, Here's a picture of the whole family. You have Moshe and Malka here on the right. You have Avi on the far right. You have her sister Bella on the top left with her Bukharan Israeli husband Amos, and all of and then you have next to my mom, you have Sally, her cousin, who's Minna's daughter, and she had 3 children. And then there are other children. Josh moved out to California, and there's other relatives there who we were less close with. But this is one of our many family gatherings from growing up. Their stories have been really well documented. You can see a whole interview with Malka at the Shoah Foundation. There's also interviews with Zadie, and I was lucky enough that he lived so long because by the time I became really interested in getting all of the details, I was able to interview him. And so I have hours of video from him where I really delved into a lot of the detail here. And here we are just 10 days before he passed away, actually, when I was in town for the CDS Gala back in January of last year. Happy until the very end. All right, that's the story. I want to get to questions. I'm just going to talk a little bit first about what's going on today and how my lessons from my grandparents inform my present. Um, there's some real, I think, strengths and virtues and lessons that I take from them. One is on expecting and accepting help from others, including non-Jews. which can be challenging. The story I remember from this is that Bubby let the soldiers take care of her when they offered to. Um, they let, she let them give her a blanket. We also have to know when and how to fight. Um, Zaidi and his friends knew that they had to take these weapons into the forest and leave and get out of a situation that was not going to go well for them, despite the fact that I don't remember if I mentioned this, but the Judenrat in Krasny was trying to stop the young men from leaving and joining the partisans. They were afraid that it would lead to worse things for the Jews in the ghetto. And of course, virtually everyone in the ghetto was murdered anyway. Staying ahead of danger, a similar lesson there. When the German lines were coming back towards 80, they knew they had to get up and move and take a risk. And then I also learned the importance of this spiritual fortitude. Both of them did not give up in different ways. Zaidi was fighting. Bubby actually, in many ways, numbed herself to what was happening around her in order to stay alive inside. And it took a long time to sort of thaw again after that experience. And she talks about that a lot. Um, so I take all of these lessons and I look at what is happening today. We have many forms of Jew hatred skyrocketing right now. We're familiar with anti-Semitism. We're familiar with neo-Nazism. Most of our society is aware of these things, although you have a lot of classical anti-Semitism skyrocketing right now in parts of the American right and also in other areas of the world. Um, you also have, of course, anti-Zionism emerging, which many people debate endlessly. Is this a form of anti-Semitism or not? And this is what I've really started to devote most of my energy to understanding and fighting, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But I've been doing a lot of writing. I've published on in Tablet. I've also am active on Instagram, doing lots of things. I'm educating people about Jewish history. I'm educating people about Jewish holidays. I'm also educating people about anti-Zionism in particular, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this all really started in 2021, actually, before the October 7th attacks, when there was a smaller war between Israel and Hamas. And I saw on social media the hostility toward Israel at first, which I wasn't as surprised by immediately, but I was surprised by its intensity, the hatred behind it. And then when I saw Jews in America being attacked in places like New York and Los Angeles, and seeing the reactions of many people who I considered friends, even to those attacks, as being deserved because of Israel or as being not as bad as things happening to other people, then I really started to see that understanding the Holocaust is not just about understanding its sort of anatomy and the atrocities that happened once it was underway, but understanding the biases and the thought patterns that led to it and the way that Jews are positioned within non-Jewish society as scapegoats and as evil and as deserving violence. Um, and I think that when October 7th came, that meant that I was somewhat more prepared for what many of us were unprepared for, or really October 8th, I should say, which is the reaction from places where we had previously felt quite comfortable to the murder of Jews. And so these days, I'm spending a lot of time and effort um, talking mostly to Jews, not to non-Jews, but I'm working to help Jews understand anti-Zionism. And by this, I do not mean criticism of Israel, I mean anti-Zionism as a hate movement. And I try to do that in a few ways. One is to just understand its tactics, which are really similar to the tactics that classical anti-Semitism uses against Jews in general: libel, stigma, denial of violence and atrocities. Um, and help people shift from defending Jews in Israel and using education as a way to combat anti-Zionism to exposing anti-Zionism itself as a hate movement and confronting it and standing up to it in a more assertive way. And one of the ways that I do that is I learn from other activist movements about describing the abuse and the oppression that we're experiencing, drawing boundaries against it, condemning it, and exposing it. Um, and this is something I'll say that I know could lead to a much larger discussion, and I know that many Jews are reluctant to do for a variety of reasons. We are afraid that it won't be received well, that it won't work. We look to saviors like Israel or like the Trump administration or whoever it might be, wherever you are on the political spectrum, someone to solve the problem for us. Um, we uh, we are afraid of attracting more hostility. And we also spend a lot of time infighting. We blame other Jews for bringing this upon us instead of standing united to expose it. So I share, this is another example on the left, something I share on Instagram about the cycle of anti-Zionist abuse. You could take the stages in these cycles, you could just replace Israel with Jews, and you would have classical anti-Semitism. The pattern is really the same. I've also written really directly about this in Tablet. You can see I wrote this just shortly after October 7th. And have gotten a very positive, a very mixed response, a very positive response, and also lots of discussion among the Jewish community. Um, but I do free trainings on this. I'll do it for one person. I'll do it for 100 people. Just reach out to me, and I'm happy to be in touch. And with that, I'm actually amazed that I'm a little bit ahead of schedule and I'm ready to take any questions you have. And I think Noah's going to be
I-
managing that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Boaz. Noah, do you want to? Just a second, we're going to switch the screens so that you and I are on there. Um, so we're going to move into a Q&A portion of the program, and I'm going to start by asking a few questions that came in, and then I encourage people to please put questions in the chat. It's a lot. I know I see some hands, but can you write them in the chat because it's hard to manage with so many people on. So Boaz, the first question we got was admittedly said a little bit unrelated to the specific presentation, but Susan Tabor asked, did you ever teach at Temple Sinai? Because her daughter had a teacher named Boaz, unless you know of another Boaz in Pittsburgh.
I I think I do know of some. I have not taught at Temple Sinai, so it would be someone else.
Got it. Okay, so the next question we have is, how do you think your grandparents' experiences shaped how they moved through the world after the war?
There were some pretty interesting trajectories here. So, like I mentioned, Zaidi Moshe grew up in a traditional, fiddler on the roofy sort of shtetl. Everything was structured around religious life. Things were changing. There were modern ideas coming through, but overall, the structure of the place was very Jewish, and almost everyone who lived there was Jewish. So it was sort of a received way of living, like most Jewish life throughout history. Bubby was raised by a father, her father Yitzchak, who actually had been from a large, very Orthodox family. You even saw like his big beard in the photo, but he actually lived quite a secular life and had moved away from that. The woman he had married, Bella, was from Warsaw, was more worldly and cosmopolitan, and he had sort of moved away from the way he was raised in his family, and they were in a larger Polish majority city. After the Holocaust, both were quite observant and spiritual. Zaidi really preserved sort of the um, traditions that he had had in the shtetl growing up, was sometimes less certain about God self. Whereas Bubby became intensely spiritual and interested in the Torah and the Talmud. Um, and so some of the movements were a little bit unexpected given how they had been raised. But they remained very observant and spiritual throughout the remainder of their lives. And mainly outside of religion and Jewishness, just really emphasize kindness, knowledge, and a refusal to hate anyone and to encourage hatred of any kind. Those were the real lessons that I took.
Our next question, Laurel asks, you said that your Bubby stayed spiritually intact. Did she share how she did that? And could you share some of that wisdom if she did?
So Bubby was 12 when the Germans came. She was uh, 18 at liberation. So when she was 18, she had been in a labor camp for almost 2 years. And before that, she had lost her family. Um, so I don't think she approached this really like with a method of remaining spiritually intact. The way she describes it is that she just existed. She expected to die. Um, and I don't think it was conscious, but what her body and her spirit did was kind of go numb. She actually remembers almost nothing from the ghetto. She, interestingly, she remembers um, more about the camp, maybe because that's where she formed some friendships. Um, and a lesson I guess I can say that I took is that it can really take time to rebuild yourself. She describes this moment with the Russian soldiers as very important, but how she didn't really heal until she went to Israel and started working with children. That started in the DP camp, but then it really started happening when she felt like she was home in Israel. And so I guess a lesson that I can share is that healing can take time and not to rush that process.
Um, Marjorie, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah.
Marjorie asks, are you seeing parallels between the lead up to the Holocaust and what's happening in the West today, especially as it relates to the demonization of Jews as Zionists? And then she also added, also, when are you moving back to Pittsburgh, Boaz?
All right, I'm going to take the less spicy of those questions, which is parallels to the Holocaust. The this is given that mom's on the line. Yes, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I really did not understand when I was growing up was that the Holocaust was not a singular event. It was the most severe flare-up of a chronic disease, and there should really be no surprises that the world, that the civilizations that dominated us for a long time, and really when it comes to Christian and Muslim civilization, arose from ours and sought to replace it. Um, it should really be no surprise that this syndrome still exists. That doesn't tell us too much about how bad it will get or what its trajectory will be this time, because there were long periods under those same conditions where Jews fared relatively well. What we can say is that, at least on social media, things are rapidly escalating. And I would emphasize that the emphasis on Zionism and the way that this new iteration of this hatred positions itself has left many of us, and also many people who are potential allies of ours, poorly equipped to respond. And that's the thing that I'm most trying to help Jews understand and train them on, is that we should not let this iteration of the hatred disguise itself. We should expose it. Moving back to Pittsburgh, we'll see.
Oh, Avi, we'll see is not a no. So I wanted to say that was a really beautiful story that you shared about how you came to that photo of Malka with Harry Schneider in the DP camp. And for those on the call who don't know, Harry Schneider was a local survivor. He currently moved. He's not living in Pittsburgh right now, but given that, for those of us who are descendants of survivors or into genealogy, can you share a little bit about some of the ways you continue to find old photos and learn new information about your family?
Yes, thanks for asking that. That's a great question. You know, the internet has sort of given new life to this pursuit for many people. Um, a few things that have been helpful are just Googling things. You can find things pretty easily. The really big challenge is names. Like, people have maiden names and things are spelled like 4 or 5 different ways in different documents. But two big resources are the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem. They have archives that are getting digitized more and more every day. You can put in your own query, but you can also write in a form to an actual archivist. And if you're related to survivors, they'll prioritize your request and they'll just send you like a zip file with everything they found with the names. And those don't always show up when you just search in the databases. reaching out to genetic family is also really helpful. We got back in touch with the descendants of these Shreveport cousins. These were, so Herschel's father, Yisrael, who was the big guy in the shuttle, some of his other children had made their way to the US, received some of the photos, but they also had lots of things about Herschel and the family, and then peripherally about Zadie. They also just remember things that my grandparents didn't say. Um, then finally, you can reach out to people on the ground in Poland or Belarus or wherever your people are from. I haven't actually dug into this too much, but I've heard that the Polish archives themselves are quite well organized, at least in certain cities, and they can give you things, they can help you translate them. We were also extremely lucky. Uh, there are some young people around Horodok in Belarus who are not Jewish, who are, for whatever reason, fascinated by the Jewish history in the area and have not only found, Russian documents that refer to things like Maizadi's service in the Red Army and even the partisans, but they are pulling weeds at the old Jewish cemetery in Haradok and putting the headstones back up and sending us film and video of that. Um, I don't know how sustainable or how widespread that is, but it's something that's happening in Zaidi. So you never know what's going to happen. Um, and I've gotten a lot of historical information about Haradok from those same people.
Wow. Um, Noah asked, did Moshe or Malka tell any stories about what it was like in the displaced persons camp in Austria after the war?
Yes, that's a fascinating story. There's a book called The Last Million by I think David Nassau that goes into a lot of like real historical detail about it. They talked a little bit about it. It was pretty segregated, Jewish versus non-Jewish. There were a lot of non-Jewish displaced people as well. I think that was partly because the Jews wanted it that way. But as Jews do, there was immediate, just thriving Jewish life in the camps, newspapers, schools, a lot of Zionism. They were organizing political structures and holding elections. Um, there was a lot going on. I think there was some organized crime. I believe that Zaidi was even involved in some smuggling and things like that. People were trying to rebuild their lives really in any way they could. But one of the most salient things was that nobody wanted to take the Jews, including the US. They took some, including Zaidi, because Truman allowed a certain number in who could be sponsored. But the problem of Jews having nowhere to go persisted after the Holocaust was over. And there were even massacres of Jews by Poles in places where they tried to return. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind when we think about the position of Jews in the world in Israel. Even in the immediate aftermath, there was almost nowhere for these surviving Jews to go. Um, I could probably go on, but those are the main things I would say.
Um, Sue shared, just as a side note, thank you so much for this amazing presentation and keeping your family stories alive and sharing them.
Thank you,
And
Sue.
yeah, and then Laurel asked, did your Zadie share how he survived 10 days without food and water? That's beyond astonishing.
Yeah, so they were moving through swamps. There was a lot of water around, but it wasn't clean. And what he described was wagon tracks in the muddy roads would collect water when it rained. So they would take a spoon and like a piece of cloth and strain the water like into their boots or something and drink it that way. So they were able to drink some water, but it wasn't like provisions. It was just from the environment.
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. So I recently gave a presentation where a student asked me if I had been my grandparents living in Germany in 1938 and saw what I experienced and what they experienced and what was going around, would I have made the same choice? Would I have left? And it's the first time I'd ever been asked that question. It actually kind of took my breath away because it's a lot to think about when you think about what they were experiencing. And so we were asked this question, which I'm sort of reframing a little bit. Like, if you had lived in 1939 in Poland and you had, do you think you would have sort of done the same thing as your grandfather of like taking up arms and going into the woods and fighting? Or I see you shaking a little bit like I had a similar
I'm
response.
shaking my head just because I feel overwhelmed by, trying to put myself in that position. I don't know what I would have done. because there's such strong impulses to survive, but also really strong impulses to reassure ourselves that things are going to be okay. Um, and this persisted, very late. Like I said, the Judenrat in Krasny, even though they knew of all the massacres happening everywhere else, believed that if they listened to the Germans and followed the rules, that they would somehow be spared. It seems crazy to us in hindsight. People also, there were rumors about the Reinhard camps and the deportations. The destruction of most Polish Jews happened quite rapidly from like the fall of 42 to the spring of 43. Very intense pace of killing. People were hearing about it. They didn't want to believe it. They got on the train. They got off at places like Treblinka, were told that they were going to be disinfected and moved on, and they were so relieved. They were so happy to be off the train. They were so happy to be told that they were going to be okay. Nobody knew for sure in real time what was going on, at least among the Jews. So when you decide, people say like, why didn't more people fight back and that kind of thing. You're taking a massive risk when you decide to fight back. You're almost definitely going to be killed. And because you don't know that there's like a systematic extermination underway, um, if you're told that you're not going to be killed if you do this or that, you're probably going to listen. So honestly, um, I don't know what I would have done in different circumstances. It was more common to become a partisan in the East because it was safer because you had the forest, and if you could get out, you had a chance. In where Bubby lived in Poland, there were very few places to hide. And look, she did listen to everything she was told to do, and she survived. So it was a period of real chaos. I think on the bigger question of like, do you leave the country or something like that because of the political changes? One thing I would say is that uh, until I think 36 or 37, there was a leader in Poland. I don't want to butcher his name, but he was basically the president who was very pro-Jewish and really protected Jews from Polish anti-Semitism. And he died. And that was basically seen by the Jews of Poland as like a catastrophe, even before they contemplated that the Germans might invade. So political winds can change very fast. I think in terms of like if and when I would leave, the something like Hitler coming to power would be a pretty clear sign that it's time to leave. Here in America, I think we still have a liberal democracy, and that's why I think there's every reason to fight hard verbally, rhetorically, with our energy now, because we know how far things can go, and we don't want to wait for them to get to that point. I see there's a question in the in the Zoom about firearms. I think that however one answers that question, we we're still upstream from it enough that what we should definitely be doing is defending ourselves. Getting a firearm is a example or a way that someone might decide to defend themselves, but that comes later. What happens right now is we fight for our place in culture, we fight for our place in institutions. If we do want to leave, there's Israel. But if we want to stay, I think that the way to stay and for things not to become like they were then is to fight, um, to speak out and expose the abuse that we're being subjected to, because we know where it leads.
And the final question that we have is Noah asks, how do we balance vigilance to anti-Semitism as Jews without building our identity and sense of self around it and responding to it? And how do you
Okay,
live?
you don't have that.
No, sadly, I forgot to order it in the
Oh.
last. Yeah.
And sorry, and how do you live out Malka's spiritual resilience and Moshe's resistance in your Jewish practice today?
This is so one thing I'll say is, in addition to becoming much more outspoken about these things, I've become much more religious. I mean, practicing Judaism, going to shul, reading. I read from the Torah a lot. We have Shabbat in our house every week. Um, it is really hard in diaspora, once you feel like you're aware of what's going on, not to make it your identity, but it's also really important not to be defined by hatred or by how other people view us. I think that if you just think about what makes a person healthy in their relationships along these lines, there is a healthy way, a grounded way to name and push back against abuse without losing who you are. I think that the answer is to be true to who we are and also just call out abuse that we see directed toward us, just like we call it out when we see it directed against other groups. Something I don't think Jews have been particularly good at historically in majority non-Jewish societies is advocating for ourselves. We're very good at advocating for others, and I think we're scared of advocating for ourselves. And so I don't think our problem is that we over define ourselves by fighting back, although there are some manifestations of that. There are narratives like, no, everyone hates us, no one's ever going to understand us, all we can do is, you know, get guns or go to Israel. Those things can be essential for survival, but there's a lot more we can do than that, including standing up for ourselves. And I think that people will actually respect us more when we do that. And that's what I do in my trainings is I help walk people through exactly how to do it. We actually practice because it's so hard for Jews to do.
Well, Boaz, thank you so much. And Laurel has asked how we can get in touch with you.
Yes.
And so I don't know, maybe in the
Okay.
chat, you want to put your
Yes.
contact or reply to her directly.
Yep.
Okay.
And I'll put it in. It's boazmunro@gmail.com, and it's Ain Ani Lee on Instagram. That's my handle if you're Instagram savvy. But please email me. Just say, I want the training. I'll set up a call with you and I'll do it. And I'll see who else we can invite. But thank you so much for having me. And it's always a pleasure to talk to the Pittsburgh community and also to honor my grandparents by sharing their story.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.